Good evening. Hello. I'm Mary Ann Young, and I'm the director of the New College Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I see a lot of familiar faces and some new ones, so we're glad you joined us. And I wanted to just say a couple of words about New College because it's a really special place. And the uniqueness of New College is the ethos of our students and our faculty, which can be described in just a word: curiosity. And it's really the desire and the drive that students and faculty have to problem solve, to learn, to understand, and dive deeply into subjects and topics. And that curiosity they follow it wherever it takes them. And with less than 1,000 students, we produce more Fulbright students and other prestigious fellowships than most of the Ivy League colleges and universities in the United States. And most recently, 2 of our students received Goldwater scholarships, which are for math and science, so we're very proud of them. So while tonight is not about New College, we hope you'll come back and to some of our other lectures and programs and get to know us a little bit better, and we look forward to having you join us on many other occasions. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Rafael Hernandez. She's Associate Professor of Sociology, and she's going to introduce the program for tonight.
Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Rafael Hernandez, not because we share the same last name, but most importantly, because his life illustrates the road taken by many Latin American thinkers. Rather than allow themselves to be limited by the rigid lines that distinguish disciplinary borders in traditional Western or Northern thinking, Dr. Rafael Hernandez took full advantage of the educational opportunities offered to him in Cuba, exploring chemistry in the early undergraduate years, earning his undergraduate degree, I believe, in literature, and pursuing then political science, earning his master's degree in political science at Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City, and then his PhD at the UNAM, also in Mexico City, in Latin American studies. These experiences provide him with the interdisciplinary outlook and the flexible imaginary that permits Latin American scholars like himself to offer us new understandings of the world we live in. Frameworks that help us break away from the mental boxes into which we have been indoctrinated. He is the founding editor of the Temas magazine, which is a forum for controversial discussions about Cuba's future. So with us, Rafael Hernandez.
Thank you. Buenas tardes. You speak Spanish. Great. Well, thank you, Sarah Hernandez. Thank you very much. The New College Foundation, Marie Young. Thank you, all of you, for facilitating, for letting me fulfill this dream of visiting Sarasota. I read about Sarasota since I was very young, because this part of the United States and Cuba are so connected for so many years, since the early years of the American nation and Cuba. And Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota are part of us, are part of our history, and continue to be part of our history, I think. So, cultural and social connections between the United States, not only Florida and Cuba, and connections between Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean countries and Latin American countries are a context without which it is impossible to understand anything happening in Cuba today. My presentation today is about what is changing in Cuba, and perhaps there are some Cubans in the audience that recognize the expression, the hour of the mameis. The hour of the mameis has to do with, with two things. Number one, with the fruit, mamey shake. If there's a Cuban heavens, mamey shake is what the Cuban deities are drinking every day. This is mameis. I suppose that many of you have tried it. But in 1762, the British Empire took over Havana. 1762 was one of the, after a few attempts to control Havana as a very important geopolitical post, they made it, and they sent over the Atlantic 11,000 troops. Imagine what was in mid-18th century to send 11,000 troops over the Atlantic. Some of these troops also came from the 13 colonies. And they put Havana under siege, and they took Havana. Very high cost. And for 11 months, Cuba was British. Well, Cuba has never been British. Cuba was under British, Havana was under British rule. And that was a very important event in Cuban history, because that was the first time the Cubans that were defending Havana, most of them were not the Spanish troops, but the Cuban militia. They were more than the Spanish troops in number. And those Cuban militia defending Havana against the British, again, because British pirates tried to take Havana a few times. These Cubans, after the British occupation of Havana was over, realized what we have been fighting for. Have we been fighting for Spain? Or we have been fighting for something else, which is ours, our land, our motherland. And that was of the first moments in which the idea of nation, of a Cuban nation as a separate thing, suppose, versus Spain, happened. Then they called the British soldiers the mameyes because of the redcoats. So the mameyes was the moment in which, la hora de los mameyes, was the moment in which the British took over Havana. It was a very crucial moment. So that expression, the hour of the mameyes, remained in Cuban culture as an expression that lasts until today. When there is something difficult, tough, and crucial, you say, and then that was la hora de los mameyes. So we could very well describe the current situation in Cuba like the hour of the mameyes. The hour of the mameyes that has to do with changes, with transformation, with the factors that were not there and are influencing changes in Cuba. My presentation is going to be about that. It is important, if we want to understand U.S.-Cuban relations, to understand that process in Cuba. The normalization process with the United States is one factor within that process of change, but one factor. Then, if we look at what is going on in Cuba in the last 20 years, not in the last 2 years, not after Fidel Castro died, but since the early 90s to the present, we will find that the current situation in Cuba, since then, the current situation is the consequence of that evolution. And that evolution is basically dictated by a new circumstance in which the Cuban society, the Cuban polity, and the economic, cultural, and psychological factors that are interplaying are creating a completely new environment. This is not 1960s Cuba. This is not 1970s or 1980s Cuba. This is a Cuba where these different variables, I'm going to explain what I mean by this immediately. This is not a factor A that is dictating a consequence B. It is not linear. It is like a matrix, and mathematicians call a matrix this representation of a few variables that are interacting, that are no variable is dictating the next one. They are interacting. So every one of these variables are interacting with each other, and this is my view of what is happening that I came to share with you. I hope that after my presentation, you will be much more confused than before. If it is so, that I will fulfill my goal. Yes, because Cuba is as complex as a society or a polity as any other country. It is not one name, it is not one factor, it is many factors that are interacting. And my intention with this is not to be mathematics. It is to represent the complexity of Cuba in the current and the present. If we don't understand the present situation, if we don't portray the complexity of the present situation, we cannot imagine a likely future. The state and civil society relations, social structure, public sphere, political economy, international reorientation, normalization with the United States, political culture, leadership, socialist idea. Let me look at each one of these variables. There is a new relationship between the state and the society in Cuba. It is not the relationship that existed in the 1960s or the relationship established in 1976 when the new constitution was issued, was approved, and when a new social, political, and economic order was born, was institutionalized, 1976. In this new relationship, the number of Cubans that are working, for example, in the public sector are not any longer 95% of the population, of the labor force. It is 70%. 70% is a lot, but the percentage of Cubans who work in the private sector who are not living on a state salary, but are living on a separate, independent source of income has increased from 5 to 30, has increased 6 times in the last 10, 15 years. The way the Cubans look at the state institutions, the way they demand from the state institution is also different. And the way Cubans are waiting for the state to solve problems is different too. A most diverse and unequal socioeconomic structure, which means Cuba is more unequal in terms of social differences, in terms of income, than it was in the 1980s. According to sociologists who study inequality, they have a term. The term is the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a little number that measures inequality. In 1988, the Gini coefficient was 0.24. Today, the Gini coefficient is estimated to be 0.40. 0.24, 0.40, almost twice. So it has increased. And that measure in terms of salary means that the salary difference that was very narrow in the 1980s, the minimum salary was 100, the maximum salary was 450. Today, the maximum income and the minimum income is much wider. Different estimates. A vibrant public sphere. Well, in the 1980s, the public sphere was dominated by the official media. This is not any longer the case. What you can see, if you can listen, if you pay attention to the current exchange of ideas in Cuba, within the institution and outside the institutions, the exchange of ideas, the flow of information available in Cuba and the public debate and the number of diverse actors that are participating in that public debate has expanded and created a completely different context. Number 4, an emerging political economy. Reforms were implemented since the early 90s. From my viewpoint, the early 90 reforms were not actually reforms because they were not part of a systemic plan. Since 2011, the 6th Congress of the Communist Party adopted a package of economic reforms called the Economic and Social Guidelines. That was the first structure package of policies that was aimed to transform the Cuban economic system. The political economy is not just that. It's not just that document. The political economy has to do with a new, different way in which life is reproduced in Cuba. The presence of the private sector, the presence of 4 million tourists, so the presence of new actors that are part of the same economic system that used to be state-centered and is much less state-centered today. And of course, the difference between the policy as it is formulated at the top level in a speech, in a discourse, the way it is implemented and the way it is applied at the local level. Everywhere in the world, the policy is formulated at the top and the policies implemented, applied at the bottom are different. So all that is part of what we could call a new political economy. The transformation of the citizens' political culture. The citizens' political culture has evolved in the last 20 years. We can talk about that if you are interested more extensively. But it is basically that it is not the political culture we had in Cuba as the prevailing political culture elements, positive and negative elements that are part of that political culture today. That is a new kind of political culture, of civic culture. The way people think about the society and the way people behave. It is not just beliefs, it is behavior. The fading away of the historic leadership. Well, the stereotypical representation is that the Cuban leadership is a bunch of old people. No offense. If you look at the average age of the Politburo of the Communist Party, which is the top political body of the Communist Party in Cuba, the average age 5 years ago was 70 years old. That is all enough. Today, the Communist Party Politburo elected last year the average age is 63. Well, over 60 years old. The Central Committee of the Communist Party and the National Assembly, the average age 5 years ago was 59. Now it is 53. Younger. What is the average age of the General Secretaries of the Communist Party in each one of the 15 provinces? We don't have any more 6. We don't have any more 12 provinces. We have now 15 provinces. What is the average age of the leader, of the Communist Party leader in each one of the 15 provinces, including the city of Havana? 46 years old. So, they are running Cuba already. If you know what is to be the General Secretary of the Communist Party in a province, he has a lot of power. They are running the country. They are running that province. Then, the process of fading away of the historic leadership. I suppose you know Fidel Castro died 4 months ago. Raúl Castro is 85 years old. But what will happen if Raúl Castro dies tonight? Is that a mystery? What would happen if President Trump dies tonight? This is a hypothesis. Who is going to be the president? You know who is the president? There's no mystery about that. Well, according to the Cuban Constitution, the president, if Raúl dies tonight, is the vice president. The vice president is 55 years old. He's 30 years younger than Raúl Castro. And he's not there as a decorative figure. He's every day on the Cuban press. He's every day on Cuban TV. He's already running the country. So this is happening. Regional and international reorientation. After the end of the Soviet bloc, after Cuba was disconnected abruptly, overnight almost, from the Soviet bloc, after that, since the 1991, the Cuba international relations got reoriented. Western Europe, Latin America, a new relationship with Africa, a new relationship with Asia, with China, and also with other Asian countries. That reorientation is a pattern, created a new pattern in terms of foreign relations. The majority of the visitors that come to Cuba in the last year were coming from Canada, 1,300,000. How many visitors, how many tourists last year? For the first time, we went beyond the line of 4 million tourists. How many Cubans? How many Cubans who live in Cuba? 11 million. What is the labor force? 5 million. 5 million labor force, 4 million visitors. And most of them come from these other countries. Most of them come from Canada, from Europe, and increasingly from the United States. How many Americans visited Cuba last year? I am not counting Cuban-Americans. This is a separate figure. How many Americans? 280,000. More than 250,000. Only Canadians are more than Americans, which is not bad for a prohibited country. Normalization with the United States. Of course, normalization with the United States is a variable, is a factor, is there. We can talk about that if you want. What happened between Cuba and the United States in the last 2 years? What is the current situation? What has happened after the first 10 years of the new administration in the United States? Normalization is a factor on that cannot be left aside, but it is a factor. And finally, a redefinition of what is socialism. If you look at and listen to the current debate in Cuba about what the socialist system, the new socialist model, the only homogeneous finding would be the socialist idea that has been defended for 50 years is not the idea of socialism defended today. Not just by the people, by the leadership. So, the diversity of views about the very definition of socialism. Well, after talking about these different variables interacting, I would like to present a list of problems. 13 problems. I like 13. This is the only reason the list is 13 problems. It could be 300 or more. This is a list of problems. Don't worry, I am not going to talk about each one. I am going to make the list, to show you the list, to give you an idea of the complexities and diversity of problems, and you will see how many of these problems are associated with US-Cuban relations or not. A heterogeneous and self-contradictory consensus. What is the meaning of that? Well, the meaning of that is that disagreement is today part of the political context of the consensus, of the political consensus, in a way that was not like the one we had in the 60s or 70s or 80s. In other words, to make it more simple, what was taken for political opposition in 1965 or in 1975 or in 1985 today is a normal comment. It's a normal expression, a natural expression, a very normal way to look at the government or the system and presenting critical views. Because yes, it is legal to present critical views of the government. This is our magazine. Let me make this commercial. It is available on internet. You can read it on internet. This issue is what kind of public sector we should have. The digital edition, you can read the digital edition, and the last issue of the digital edition that was not yet printed is focused on inequality and poverty. Inequality and poverty is an issue that cannot be discussed without looking at the government policies and criticizing and assessing the government policies. Just as an example of what I mean by that. Normalization, the naturalization of disagreement is part of the public debate in Cuba and recognized by the government. Increase inequality and poverty. I would like to talk a little bit about that because it is a fundamental question that has to do not only with our next issue, it is associated with the problem. Because a socialist model, no matter what kind of socialist model, is supposed to be a fundamental part of a socialist model, the question of equality and the question of avoiding poverty. Early demographic transition. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I think it is a good way to understand that not every problem we have is a consequence of a bad policy or the consequence of mistakes, of the consequence of stupid ideas. It is the consequence of social development. Increased migration outflow. Since the 1990s, the migration outflow had been increasing. If we look at the normalization factor and migration, the very day the normalization was announced, that was a factor influencing migration and increased migration. In 2014, migration to the United States was 15,000 Cubans through a third country, and 25,000 Cubans who received visas in the US consulate in Havana. So 20 plus 15. When normalization was announced, many Cubans realized this. If normalization is announced, chances are that the Cuban adjustment law will be eliminated, and that the wet food, dry food policy that makes a privileged case, the case of the Cubans, that may be eliminated. And they were right. That was eliminated. But because they believed that that could be eliminated, they rushed to the American border, like a cousin of mine who was studying in Mexico, and next time I knew about him, he was in Los Angeles. I said, what are you doing in Los Angeles? He said, Rafael, you know, nobody knows how long this is going to last. 45,000 Cubans looked at the problem, understood what was going on the same way that my cousin. So from 15,000, the number increased to 45,000. 2015, 2016, now that the wet food, dry food policy is over, has been canceled so far. Let's see what happened in terms of the migration through a third country. Family income gap vis-a-vis consumption market prices. This is a fundamental problem, the problem of the real income and the problem of the free market prices. Supercentralization. Well, if you ask me, what is the most critical issue? What is the most critical problem in the Cuban socialist model? I would say supercentralization. The system has been very centralized and vertical for all these years. Actually, I don't think we have ever had a really decentralized government since the colonial times, compared with other countries in the hemisphere. But particularly in the last half a century, that centralization and that verticality was stronger. So it is about the target of reforms is to make the system, to transform the system that is like this, to do it like this. Try to do this with your arms. It is easy. It is easy to do that with your arms. Try to do that with the political system or the decision-making structures, the bureaucracy. Overextended state sector. Well, the state sector has increased. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, the state sector took over everything, including hamburger shops and pizzas. So this is one of the targets of reform, a state-centered socialist model, and a bureaucracy associated with that overextended state sector. I was talking about tourism. Tourism is a fundamental industry, excuse me, in today's Cuba, in contemporary Cuba. That 4 million visitors, do we have the environment that may resist in a sustainable way that amount of tourism if that continues to increase and increase and increase and increase? There is a colonial city in south central Cuba, the most beautiful colonial city, I think, in Cuba, Trinidad. 85% of Trinidad bedrooms available for tourists are private bread and breakfast. So tourism in Trinidad is almost 100% private. Restaurants, transportation, lodging. A friend of mine who lives in Trinidad and is in that business told me that last year the figures about energy consumption, water consumption, and food consumption increased 5 times. So the Trinitarians need 5 times the energy and the water and the food. Let's suppose, well, they could produce more food, more energy, water. Where do they get 5 times more water to have a sustainable tourism industry in a small city like that has not a lot of water? So this is a challenge. This is a challenge. This is celebrating the 4 million tourists visiting Cuba. Must keep in mind that that is a lot of pressure on sustainable tourism. Change civic values. Change civic values that have to do about a different view about what is private, about what is social, about what is a state, about what is collective, or what is individual. All those values are in the process of change, and much more than that. Information access. What are called information technologies access. Well, there is a prevailing perception that Cubans don't know what is internet. There is no access to internet. No, zero internet. I should have brought a picture of a family in Trinidad Skyping with their children in the Trinidad Public's Wi-Fi service using this. Where did they get this? If that is a pre-internet country. And much more than that, how did they know how to use it? So this is a typical image, a typical photo in any park in Cuba, people talking, Skyping with their relatives and friends who live here or in other parts of the world. And finally, the question of the media system. In Cuba, there's almost no private media, but we don't have public media. Cuban media are rather government media than public media. Public media is the BBC. Public media is Radio France Internationale. Public media is the PBS. The Cuban media are broadcasting official news. So as long as it is like that, and that is changing, as long as it is like that, that is a problem. And finally, normalization with the US and the six fortress mentality that for many years has been a problem and a factor conditioning the Cuban mind. Bueno, I was thinking of I was going to talk about increasing inequality and early demographic transition, but it is up to you. If you want me to talk about that, you ask me questions. I don't want to be talking here forever without you to have the opportunity to ask questions. So this is a very preliminary list of problems. And as you can see, the majority of these problems have nothing to do with the United States. So the solution of these problems are not necessarily connected with relations with the United States. Better relations with the United States would facilitate changes. But that doesn't mean that the United States is the cause of these problems. So if we look, I'm going to finish with this, the policies of updating socialism, that is the name used. It is basically policies around this, around fighting hyper-centralization, fighting overextended state, and fighting the weak rule of law. Decentralize. Decentralized is a fundamental content in Cuban reforms. It is about releasing power to the local level. Why it is taking so slow? Why it is taking so long? Remember? This is a redistribution of power. The power that is concentrated at the top should be released, should be shared with the bottom, with the local. Any redistribution of power is a political change. And you cannot change decentralized economy without decentralizing political decisions at the same time, because it is decisions about the economy are political decisions. Number two, expand the non-state sector. As I was telling you, that Cuba was 95% of the labor force 25 years ago was working for the public sector. 95% of the labor force. And only 5% of the labor force in Cuba was private. 1988, 89, 1990. 5% were farmers. Farmers who own their lands. That have been there all these years. They own 15% of the land. The rest of the land, 85% of the land, is owned by the state. It is not just state enterprises, but the land. This new policy is transferring the use of the land, of the 85% of the land that is no longer state land in terms of who is using the land, to the cooperatives. So today, 65% of the land is in cooperative hands. This is not the state. This is private cooperatives that own the land and they lease the land. They have a contract for 25 years on every piece of land they are working on. They pay nothing for that lease. They pay zero for that lease. They have the right to use the land for 25 years. And the real consequence of that is that the majority of the Cuban food production is today not made by state farms or state workers, but by cooperative and also, of course, by private farmers. Today, what is called self-employment, which is a very generic word to talk about anything, a lady that is selling peanuts and a guy who runs 3 restaurants, it's not exactly the same category. That is supposed to change in terms of legal definitions. But the number of legal activities that can be performed, can be exercised, increased to more than 200,000. And as I said, the private labor increased from 5 to 29% in 2016. And the Cubans have started to pay taxes. These Cubans here, started to pay taxes after more than 50 years that they don't pay taxes. Do they like to pay taxes? Of course they don't like to pay taxes. Of course, that when they say, they complain this way. Do you imagine to pay 5% of my income in taxes? My income is low enough. How come that I have to pay taxes? So a new civic culture about paying taxes is also part of the new context, of the new circumstances, and increasingly, all Cubans, including those who are living on salaries, on state salaries, will have to pay taxes at some point. And finally, the rule of law. And I am about to end with this slide. The law as an instrument of change. Reforms cannot be implemented just by political discourses or by political decisions. We need legislation. And legislation is the bottleneck of reforms. There is a long list of bills, it's a long list of draft laws that has not been discussed by the National Assembly, that is waiting to be discussed and approved by the National Assembly. For instance, a new law for the media, a new media law, a new ley de la prensa that creates a legal framework to give autonomy, legal autonomy to the media. Continue leadership, demographic transition, I talked about that already. Increase the co-op model in non-agricultural sectors. The countryside is full of cooperatives, but the urban areas, cooperatives are still very few. The idea that cooperatives should be a model that should be incentive, that should be stimulated, is expressed in political discourses, but not necessarily in the practice. A new private sector law that makes the difference between the lady who sells peanuts and the guy who runs 3 restaurants. And finally, a constitutional reform that creates the constitutional framework within which a new model, a new socialist model may be defined. A new definition of property that recognizes the diversity of properties, not just the property, the state property or the means of production, but the private property on means of production, and the different kind of property definitions of property as a concept. The new ideas about the political system, the shrinking of the National Assembly, the reduction of the National Assembly. The National Assembly in Cuba is larger than the US Congress. It is too much. Perhaps it is too much. And a few amendments that are needed to restrict and regulate how many years can anyone hold a top political position. How many years can anyone be the president or the vice president or the minister or the general secretary of the Communist Party or to hold any top political position? How many years? Regulated not by a political decision, not by a political statements, but by the law and by the Constitution. That has to be in the Constitution. Well, I think this is enough. Thank you very much. Well, if you want to look at these other features of what is the new socialist model? So it has to do with a diversity of forms of property and management, the role of the foreign direct investment, the role of the market and the private property, the predominance of the public sector, avoid concentration of property and wealth in a few hands. This is what the new political documents issued by the government and the party are saying about what should be the framework for this new socialist system. And in terms of kinds of property, these are the kinds of properties I was talking about that are on the table. This is not final, because this cannot be final until we have it in the Constitution. Well, forgive me. I don't know why Cubans have that bad reputation of talking too long. Yes, sir.
I have a question, Dr.
Hold on 1 second, hold on.
I have a question, Dr. Hernandez, on your very comprehensive analysis of the Cuban situation. Since Cuba has been under the influence of the Castro brothers for so long in this pyramidal way that you have described, and everything has been owned by the state, and as you were indicating, 95% of the people worked for the state until recently. The Cubans have developed a way of living that includes theft. That is something that you have not mentioned, theft. In Cuba, everything is taken from wherever it is found. And that has created a mentality in the Cuban population, in my opinion, that the Cuban is not interested in sacrificing himself or herself in work because nothing has been theirs until now. It might start, who knows? And that they are used to steal from the government. Would you care to address the issue of stealing?
Well, ¿puedo hablar desde aquí? You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Let me introduce a few nuances. The crisis in the 1990s, not before, created an environment in which that kind of problems emerged. It was not all the time. It was associated with this period. Second, what you are saying is discussed in Cuba is one of the other 300 issues I may have listed. And the name of that is corruption. According to Transparency International, an international NGO that is looking after corruption and evaluates corruption according to an index, Cuba is one of the 5 least corrupted countries in the Americas. I don't know how they measure that. I know they are not the Communist Party. You see, corruption is a problem. Corruption is a problem, and if Cuba is one of the 5 countries with the least corruption, according to Transparency International, that for me is not a reason to be happy. Because our problems cannot be, well, there are many other countries with more poor people or more unequal people. Because we cannot, I think, develop a more just, which is the idea, a more just society, a better society, no matter how we call it. Let's leave aside how we call it. A better society, a more not uniform society, but where equality is a real value and a real practice, and this is part of people's belief and ideas and behavior. Corruption is all over the world. Take a look at reports. I think that it is such a problem, it is such an important problem, that it is part of the Cuban government agenda. And they have open discussions about that. So the bad news is that we have it. The good news is that we can discuss about that openly.
You talked about how there are many things that could not be discussed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that are now openly discussed. Are there still taboo subjects or taboo things that will get someone in big trouble if they talk about it?
I am asked that very often because I run a magazine. In practical terms, if you ask me what I cannot publish about, my answer is, I don't know. No one has told me, when we have published for the first time about something, no one has told me, do it. And I know that many times when we publish a critical article about something, for example, racial inequality. Racial inequality not based on opinions, but based on sociological research field research done in Havana, Santa Clara, and Santiago de Cuba by sociologists, professional sociologists. Then present these boring tables with the statistics that prove with numbers that there's racial prejudice didn't disappear. Again, the bad news is that we have it. The good news is that we can publish that. When I published that, a friend of mine who has a middle position in the Cuban bureaucracy told me, I don't think this was a good idea to publish that. I told him, well, racial questions is not taboo. It was something that was politically incorrect in the 80s or 70s, but not anymore. That in many places, that is discussed. And I read many opinions about that. He said, yes, but those are opinions. This has the statistics. This is proving that racial prejudice is there with scientific evidence. Well, the last chapter of my story, excuse me if I make anecdotes to answer the questions, or perhaps may illustrate better, was that someone from the top leadership read the article and said it was a wonderful article, very good, because it was measuring the problem. And that person is the guy who, in the Politburo, was in charge of the question of race, in charge of that kind of discussions and that kind of problems, because this is part of the agenda. Do you think that any of this is something I discovered? No. It's something that is discovered by Cubans that are very critical of the Cuban government. No, no, no. Everything I'm saying and the rest of the 300 problems are part of many agendas today in many institutions in Cuba, including governmental and political institutions, with different views. To answer your question, I have had many problems with publishing articles that are critical of this or that. This is what is publishing a magazine about. If publishing a magazine was to be happy and quiet, drinking mojitos in the porch of my house, I couldn't be doing that. This is something that has to be done. And the majority of Cuban academics, the majority of Cuban researchers are fighting for having the agenda expanded more and more. The question is not like, this is something that you cannot talk about. The question is, where are the data? You see, access to the data. So, talk to any Cuban sociologist, talk to any Cuban economist. Where are the data? We need the hard data for this. Where is the data for doing that? So they have to be sampling instead of conducting national surveys, national polls. So the access to information. I can give you a few Raúl Castro speeches criticizing secrecy, against the secretismo. This is a word he invented. Secretismo. Secretismo is that I don't have the data to discuss or to do my research on anything. But I don't know what is forbidden as a subject. This is a research magazine. This is not a journal. I mean, this is not a newspaper. This is not a political party magazine. So we don't publish opinions. I love to read opinions, but we don't publish opinions.
Thank you. I thought, do you have a question? Because I think he raised his hand before I did. Okay.
Bueno.
Well, this
I was
month.
trying to be more democratic and pluralistic.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
Isn't about
This
that?
month, I got to do something that wasn't even on my bucket list because I never thought I would get to do it in my life. My husband and I just returned from Cuba. And so we were there, and we were there on one of the first American cruise ships to go in. And I think they got to go in because the president of the ocean cruise line is from Cuba. And so we were the only ship in port. And any of you that have been to any of Central America or Mexico or any place else, that's really unusual. And it's a small ship. And I have tried to write an article, or I did. I just finished it this weekend. And I sent out notices to people on some travel groups that I'm involved in Facebook and said, would you like the full article on tips and thoughts about travel in Cuba? Well, I have gotten lots of requests, but no one can tell me where I can get this published, it seems. But what do you think about tourism in Cuba?
Are you going to give it to me? Can I publish it?
Can you publish it? I brought a copy, I thought. And I just ran it off before I came today. That was funny, I thought.
If you do some research about the topic, I would love to publish it.
Well,
do you know how many cruise ships are expecting to come?
Well, that's what so many people have written back saying, we're planning to go to Cuba this year, next year.
26 cruise ships.
Oh,
so
see?
Imagine,
yeah, we were on the second one.
How big was our cruise ship?
Our cruise ship was 1,200 people.
1,200. Mm-hmm. You know that there are bigger cruise ships.
I know they're a lot bigger.
Imagine 3,000 cruise ship.
I can't imagine
it. Descending on old Havana at the same time.
I can't imagine it. And we went into, the interior, and I can't imagine it there either.
My friends who study the environment, who are studying urban development, who are not against tourism, but are very afraid of the kind of tourism that may be, and the kind of profit that may be benefiting, in this particular case, Cuba, and this is an idea that mainly the economists have. How much of what the 3,000 tourist cruise ship people visiting Old Havana at the same time, how much are they going to live? Because they are going to have lunch and breakfast and sleep in the ship, isn't it? Okay.
Yeah, so, we got to sleep in the ship.
But this is just the economic side of that. For how long will you be able to interact with Cubans, with the Cuban society, with a real Cuba? How long will you have? If you stay for 5 days, and you are staying in the bread and breakfast, the number of bread and breakfasts are increasing faster than the number of state hotel rooms. Faster.
Well, we saw a hotel that's being built by China.
Particularly in the city of Havana, not only in Trinidad. If you stay for 5 days or for 7 days with a Cuban family, I think that this is a very good experience. Not only economically, but socially and culturally. Because we can learn from each other. You can visit and talk to the real Cubans that are there and listen to what are their concerns and their problems. And when you return to Sarasota, you will have an idea of how is the Cuban society. Havana is not Cuba. Havana is Havana.
Right.
But you can have an idea of the real Havana, of the real Cuba, instead of just reading about that. You go and have your experience. I lecture to a group of 20, 30 Americans that are visiting Cuba, not in cruise ships, because they don't have time. I have my sociological study of Americans visiting Cuba is to lecture to them for an hour. And I tell them more or less this. You know what? They are fascinated by Cuba and the Cubans. And when I ask them, why you were coming to Cuba right now? Because there are restrictions. You have to come with a group. You cannot come on your own because it is illegal if you visit Cuba as a tourist. You are a visitor, and you have to come with a group. Okay? And I asked them, why did you choose to do that? And the answer, 70% of the case is, I wanted to see Cuba as Cuba has been all these years. I don't want to see Cuba as Cuba will be after McDonald's comes. Because when McDonald's comes, the McDonaldization of the Cuban environment on the Cuban citizens will change and make Cuba like any other country around. So I want to see Cuba as it has been with this government. And to me, it's surprising because I couldn't believe that that was happening. That this is what they have. They are taking a pink convertible Cadillac, drive along the seawall.
We did that. Ours
With
was
a
green Cadillac.
with a shot of aged rum in one hand and
we
a
didn't
cigar
have
in your other hand. Do you know what they are feeling? They feel like Humphrey Bogart and Rory McCall.
No, we really got out. We walked
I am
around.
surprised.
We met people.
These are my findings. So please look for. We need some information, some real information, not just impressions. But if you send it to me, I'd be delighted to publish it in the website. We have a website, and in our website we have a blog. And we would love to publish that in our blog.
Okay.
Our blog is not only for academics. Question.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're coming close to time for me to go, so we'll take one more question, and after that we will have a reception. Before we go, I have another announcement, but it's going to take.
Bueno, lo primero que quiero decir es muchas gracias por su presencia. Son pocas las veces que hay otro cubano aquí en esta área, así que es verdaderamente un privilegio. And my question will be in English. I just wanted to ask, you were speaking mainly on income inequality between Cuba and like the relation between US and Cuba. And as a part of the Cuban diaspora, like one experience that's fairly universal is the act of sending remittances back to Cuba. And so you were also speaking on racial inequality in Cuba. And so a lot of the remittances sent back to Cuba are being sent back by wealthier white Cubans in Miami and in other parts. And the remittances also allow the establishment of private businesses and things like that. So I would appreciate if you could speak a little bit on the relationship between the diaspora, the remittances, and what that permits, what that capital permits for certain people in Cuba, and yeah, basically along those lines.
Well, thank you for that question. According to sociologists, American sociologists who study remittances to Cuba, they say, Susan Eckstein, Lorena Barberia, they say that the majority of remittances don't come from the wealthiest Cubans, but from the Cubans who left Cuba mainly in the 1990s or after 1980. That doesn't mean that Cubans who left Cuba earlier don't send remittances, but that in the big numbers, those who left Cuba as part of a family strategy to send money back, that was part of a family strategy since the 1990s, and that changed the pattern of the Cuban migration, according to sociologists. They are sending money back, and this is part of the current real income in Cuba. In other words, Cubans who came here or who went to Spain or to Mexico or to Russia or to Beijing. I found Cubans in Tokyo. And they are sent, all of them, they are employees, they are workers. Some of them work as professionals, but very few of them have business, real business, big businesses. I've met a few, just a few. They send money back, and the estimate about remittances to Cuba is very wide. But estimates are that between $2 and $3 billion are received in Cuba every year, particularly from the United States, and that income comes to family that, as you said, the majority of those who receive those remittances are white families. because it has to do with the percentage of non-whites who left Cuba. Particularly in Norway, 80% of the Cubans are non-white. But the vast majority of Cubans who left Cuba live here, and the vast majority of them are white. No, they are not blacks or mulattoes. So the role, the meaning of that remittances changed in the last years in the context of reforms. Those remittances were just consumption funds, not anymore. One increasing part of those remittances are capital. What capital? Capital for the families of the people who are sending the remittances that invest. Because the majority, those are estimates, the majority of investments in this growing private sector doesn't come from Cuban banks. Most Cuban banks give loans. According to the law, Cuban banks can give loans for anyone that want to start a private business. But the fact is that the majority of the business are not based on loans from Cuban banks, but from banks from here, despite the embargo. And buying houses, same thing. Now that it's legal to buy and sell houses. The majority of Cuban banks are making loans, 80% of loans, according to bank statistics, are given to people that need to repair their houses. Because housing is the most critical issue in Cuba, particularly in big cities. But this is just happening. This is not a direction. This is not a rule. No? So, the reconciliation on the two sides. I always recommend to go to the air terminal in Havana, and now to the air terminal in many cities in Cuba, and sit there with a camera and a book and a notebook, and take note of what you see. When the Cubans who live in the United States get out of the plane, and the Cubans that are on the Cuban side, on the island side, are there. And this is the reconciliation. The pictures you are taking and the notes you are taking are about the reconciliation. That is happening. That is not going to happen. That is happening already. And that will continue to happen more and more because it has to do with the people-to-people relations. And the people-to-people relations don't have to be submitted, to be restricted, to be controlled and restricted by any of the two governments. Thank you.